everyone, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, the 8th of June. So I wanted to talk a little bit about extensions because we're approximately a class behind or so. So journal number 2 on persuasion is now going to be due on Tuesday. Instead of the 8th on Thursday, it'll be due on the 13th on Tuesday. So that'll give us some time to finish up with the novel. That'll be due at 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. Very similar to what you did with journal number 1, about a page or so response of thoughts and reflections and ideas about persuasion. And in terms of the papers, which I wanted to talk about today, paper number 1, I'm also giving an extension for. So now that will be due on June 20th, which is a Tuesday. So you've got an additional class for each of those assignments. Of course, you can always hand in the assignments early. The paper, very different from the journal because it is evaluated in a formal manner. So I'm evaluating for grammar and mechanics as well as for content. It's a critical paper, so you shouldn't be consulting outside resources. This is based on your understanding and your learning about the text. And I'm estimating about 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be. Double space, 1-inch margins. Due also by 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about that first paper and to also begin talking about persuasion. So as I indicated, I had uploaded a handout in the syllabus and other documents folder that's entitled Critical Paper. And I wanted to review that with you. And in fact, I can tell you this was a handout that was given to me when I was an undergraduate student many years ago. And I still think it's one of the best out there in terms of reviewing how to write a paper. So, as you know, that the first paper would be addressing the first set of readings, which is probably either Frankenstein or Persuasion. The Story of an Hour is also a possibility, though that's a very different kind of exercise, talking about a short story. And that you can rewrite this paper for a higher grade. So once I evaluate and return it to you, you can take my comments into account. And then at that point, you can revise. I ask that you submit in the revision along with the original with my comments, and you get the higher of the 2 grades, which is really the way professional authors write, is that they get feedback and they do lots of revision. The idea behind paper number 2 is that you've already learned how to write a paper with paper number 1, so you wouldn't necessarily need a revision. Paper number 2 would be about the latter set of readings over the semester, but that said, occasionally I'll have a student who hands in a paper number 2 early enough that we can negotiate the possibility of a revision, but that isn't something that's guaranteed the way it is with the first paper. And paper number 2, similar in that it's a critical paper of approximately 4 to 5 pages long as or as short as it needs to be to defend your thesis. And I'm hopeful that perhaps some of the writing you've done in your journals or in the class discussion forums might help give you some ideas of what you could pursue with a paper. So if you look at the notes below about paper number 1, you'll see that I have recommended a resource for you that you probably are aware of, Purdue OWL. This is from Purdue University, where they've made their writing resources available to the public, so you don't need to be a registered student. I suspect you probably already have guidebooks about how to write English papers, and certainly the GCC library also has sections as well as how to go about writing. But I definitely recommend Purdue OWL. It reviews the entire writing process from the beginning, generating ideas, to the very end, which is editing and submission. I'm going to review briefly some of the elements about writing a paper, though I'm hopeful that this is something that you might have talked about in previous English classes. So this is, as I said, in the syllabus and other documents folder, talking about the critical paper. where the point is to analyze, not to summarize. So it's not what I call the junior high school book report. Basically, what you're doing is you are interpreting, not talking about what happened, but why those things happen. So assume the reader is familiar with the text and that you are basically interpreting. Avoid the temptation to retell the story. You only have to retell those pieces that are necessary for support for your particular analysis. Begin with a strong thesis, and usually that's put in the beginning of the paper in the opening paragraph. That said, you don't necessarily have to write in chronological order. I have had students who have basically started with the body of the paper, the midsection of the paper. Once they're done with that, they reread what they've written and they summarize that in a sentence or two. And that is their thesis, which they put in their opening. So part of the process of writing is actually discovering and learning along the way. So your thesis needs to be comprehensive enough to be important, but not so general or bland as to be meaningless. So some examples of that. For instance, saying something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience is so broad, it basically applies to every author and every text that probably has ever been written. Or saying something like, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. And my initial response to something like that is, well, yeah, so what? The point is to determine what imagery is employed and why. So, as you are writing the body paragraphs of your paper, you are writing basically paragraphs that have certain elements associated with them. We usually talk about the first sentence of a paragraph as the topic sentence. And if you have a well-written paragraph, most of your paragraphs will have a topic sentence that basically summarizes what the paragraph is about. So what you should be able to do at the ending of your writing is read the opening sentences of your paragraphs, and that should give you a good sense of direction of the major arguments that you've covered in your paper. So supporting your points is also something that you need to do within the paragraph. My job is basically to take the opposite position of whatever it is you say, regardless of whether or not I agree or disagree with you. Your job is providing evidence, almost like an attorney to a courtroom, to show how your position is possible. It doesn't even need to be probable or even correct, just possible. And the way that you provide evidence is through paraphrase, using your own language about sections of the text, and also quotation, direct language from the text word for word. So you definitely want to avoid the extremes. I've seen some papers where there's no quotation. You can't do that. You need quotation. That's part of your evidence. But you don't want to add quotation merely to give your paper length. Keep in mind that I had suggested 4 to 5 pages approximately. It really is less about length and it's more about content. I kind of liken it to telling a painter as to how many colors the painter should use in their painting, which is absurd. The painter makes that decision based on, of course, their abilities, their preferences, and the actual painting itself. The same thing should occur with your writing. So usually we consider ending a paragraph with a quotation bad practice because we are supposed to comment on the relevance of the quote. That said, there are occasions where you could do something like that. You can always break the rules. Now, paragraphs need to be well developed. At minimum, they're 3 sentences long with a beginning, a middle, and an ending, though they're probably a lot longer. If you've got anything less than 3 sentences, it's not a paragraph, at least from an academic perspective. Even though the media, let's say news reporting or journalism, will oftentimes use 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, but that's not usually what we expect in academic papers. And the kind of writing you do in an academic paper is the kind of writing that's usually expected in the workplace. So that's the connection between the two. So your paragraph should be minimum 3 sentences, hopefully a lot longer, and that's because you are defending your position with evidence from the text. And you want to find an interesting way to conclude. So you've got an introductory paragraph that gives your thesis. Again, it's got to be 3 or more sentences long. You've got body paragraphs with your supporting points that are 3 or more sentences long. And all of those paragraphs, or most of them, have topic sentences. First sentence that summarizes what that particular paragraph is about. Then you have a concluding paragraph, and it's supposed to give closure to your writing. It's perhaps one of the harder paragraphs to write because ultimately at this point you've probably exhausted everything you wanted to say, and you're probably tired as well. So you want to save a little bit of energy for the end and to say, find some sort of interesting way to conclude. Don't just recopy your introduction. Perhaps you can hint at a related idea or apply your thesis to another work by the same author. 9 out of 10 times, if you apply whatever it is you're talking about to contemporary times, that will work as a conclusion. Just a suggestion if you're struggling with your conclusion. So this is all listed in the first section of that handout that's called planning, the section that most students skip. They go straight to writing. So it behooves you to spend some time just sort of thinking and contemplating about what it is you're going to write about. Do some brainstorming. Write out some ideas. Again, not worried about grammar or mechanics, but just getting those ideas out there. Then you can think about the writing, making those ideas sound pretty, so to speak, and in sentences that are grammatically correct. The first principle of good writing is economy. The second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So this is something that I struggle with in my own writing, being wordy. So the idea is that you've got lots of time to go through whatever writing you've done so that you can edit and polish. And if there is a way for you to rephrase a sentence in fewer words without sacrificing that sentence's meaning, then you should do that. Because usually what you want is something that's tight. And I know that means that you're going to have a shorter paper. Again, it's less about the length and it's more about the content. Better to have a shorter, well-written paper than to have a longer paper with a lot of unnecessary language. You want to use strong nouns and verbs. Things like adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words, can be helpful, but don't just use them to pad your sentences for length. Use the active to the passive voice. Passive is as if something is occurring to you, or the subject of the sentence. And the subject of the sentence is who or what is performing an action. As opposed to active, where it seems like the subject of the sentence is actually engaged in the action. So to give you an example, I could say, Lillian graded the journals. That's an active sentence. Graded is the verb, the action. The subject, who or what performs the action, is Lillian. So it very clearly shows that Lillian is engaged in the grading. I could also say the grading was done by Lillian. It's not grammatically incorrect, but it's passive. It's as if the grading was happening to Lillian. But another way to think about this is just to do a simple word count. That an active sentence, Lillian graded the papers, is 4 words long, as opposed to the papers were graded by Lillian, 6 words. And keep in mind that the fewer words, the better if you're not sacrificing meaning, generally speaking. Avoid cliches, overused expressions. Avoid slang, informal language that is basically meant to obscure meaning from the masses. That's why slang is created. Think about what adolescents do every generation. And yes, sometimes slang goes mainstream so that everyone is using it. But slang is considered informal language, again, not necessarily appropriate for the workplace, not necessarily appropriate for academia. And the reason why is because there's just a greater possibility of misunderstanding. So you want to try to reduce the possibility of misunderstanding as much as possible. And think about a second language learner struggling with some of the slang in English. That someone is a cool person. And we're not talking about temperature. We're talking about their temperament. Or think about some of the expressions that we use. It's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? However, I always give an example. So if you are a returning student, you've heard this example. It's actually taken from the news in the 1990s. I try usually to give amusing stories, but this story is not amusing. But it is true. And it happened to a second language speaker. Actually was going to a party. He went to the wrong house. And this house had been burglarized previously. So let's just say the owner was nervous. Nevertheless, the student knocked on the door. The owner opened the door. The student asked if this was the location of the party. The owner responded with a slang term that I suspect most of you know the meaning of, freeze, which would mean to stop. And for whatever reason, whether the student misheard or misunderstood, the student took a step forward. And the owner responded by pulling out the gun, which he always carried on him, and shooting it off and killing that student right there on his doorstep. All because of a misunderstanding of language. It completely changed how language is taught in classrooms across America. That yes, you need to know the language of business, the language of academia, but you also need to know the language of, for lack of a better word, the streets, because we speak very differently than we write. And the context of the situation oftentimes will determine how we write. We write very differently in a text message or in an email than we would, let's say, in an academic essay or a business report. So when we talk about writing in school and business, it's usually much more formal. And when in doubt, always go the more formal route. So I was taught in a very conservative fashion, so much so that we were taught to avoid contractions, which is where you take two words and you condense them into one. So rather than saying do not, you would say don't. And we do that all the time in our language when we speak, but in writing, it's considered a little bit more formal to write it out, do not. So again, that's nothing that could be incorrect, but I encourage you to avoid contractions. There's enough of my schooling in me that I always feel the need to identify contraction in someone's writing. Not that that would in any way influence your grade. Definitely avoid the use of I think, I feel, I will argue. It's wordy if nothing else, because the entire paper is how you think or you feel or you will argue. And if only I had $1 for every time someone made this mistake, I'd be quite rich, because it goes completely against your intuition. It seems quite counterintuitive. You want to maintain the present tense when you're talking about a piece of literature. I'm well aware the literature was written in the past, which is why you probably want to write in the past tense. Or if no other reason why, you read it in the past, even if it was just a few minutes prior. But we talk about literature happening in the present to universalize it. So it wasn't that Mrs. Mallard said free, free, free. It's that Mrs. Mallard says free, free, free. Keep it in the present tense. So if you have difficulty doing that, certainly you can go write everything in the past tense, but when you're in the editing phase, you want to change it over to the present. Which gets us to the third part of this handout, which is also the piece that most people are likely to skip. Most people will skip the planning stage, go straight to the writing stage, which actually is more time-consuming and frustrating. And then they'll run out of time and energy, so they won't spend any time in the proofreading stage. So you want to spend a little bit of time where you could actually review your writing. What would be ideal would be a few days. With something as condensed as the summer session, it might just be a few hours. That you step away from the writing, you don't think about it, you don't consider it, and then you try to go to it with a fresh eye. So that if you have difficulty when you're proofreading, what you might want to do is read backwards. Start at the end and work your way to the front. That will allow you to focus on the actual sentences themselves, which is how we evaluate grammar, not on the content. And do know that you should call your paper something. It should have a title, and it should be an original title that's based on your thesis. You shouldn't be calling a paper the same title as the author. So you shouldn't call your paper on Frankenstein, Frankenstein. That title's already been taken by Mary Shelley. Now, certainly you can embed the title within your own title. For instance, you might want to talk about, let's say, the fears of difference in Frankenstein. And we do have a convention when we are referring to published texts. If it is a novel or a drama or something that can appear on its own, we either italicize or underline that title. If it is a short story title, then we put that in quotation marks. The assumption is that all these things have been published previously. This is how we tell the distinction between a short story as opposed to something like a novel or a drama. Poems also are put in quotation marks, shorter works basically. That said, your title should not be in quotation marks or underlined or italicized or bolded or put in a bigger font or anything else. It should be the same as your paper itself. Certainly, if you're referencing a title within your own title, such as Frankenstein, then the word Frankenstein should be italicized or underlined. But you don't want to do that with the entire title itself. You want to identify the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph, in addition to your thesis, so it's very clear to the reader who you're talking about, what you're talking about, and what your position is going to be. And to give you an idea how old this handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. This paper does need to be typed, double space, 1-inch margin. Ideally, it would have a title page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists, or a separate screen, if you want to think about it that way, since you're doing it electronically, that just lists your name, my name, the due date, as well as the paper title. And the paper is due on the date assigned, obviously, at the beginning of class. So if you needed an extension, please ask me. Don't just miss that particular class because you don't have your paper. So those are just a few elements that are in that handout, the critical paper. And you can see in the notes below this video, it talks a little bit about the first paragraph in the thesis, the body paragraphs with their evidence, quotation. As I had indicated, you are going to be expected to use quotation, and we use something called the MLA, the Modern Language Association System, which I'm hopeful that you heard of in previous classes. There are different systems for different disciplines. So for instance, there's something called the APA, the American Psychological Association, and this is a system you use for the sciences, and you don't want to mix them up. So while it would be appropriate to use the APA for the sciences, it would not be appropriate to use the APA for an English class. You would use instead the MLA system, Modern Language Association. And basically this system is devoted to the humanities and to languages. And the crux of the system is using parentheses, that after you've quoted something, and quote marks indicate that you're using a direct quote, immediately following that quote, whether you have finished your sentence or not, you include a set of parentheses. And within those parentheses, you write the least amount of information. I repeat, the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to identify the location of that quote, in the event that the reader wanted to verify the authenticity of that quote. And at the very ending of the paper, there's something called the works cited page, which lists all of the works that you've cited or you've referenced throughout your paper, all by author's last name in alphabetical order. And there are certain criteria that you need to follow for listing information about a book. That would be slightly different than a magazine article. That would be slightly different from a website. You get the idea. And basically, you just follow the system almost the way that you would follow the rules in a cookbook. You don't necessarily need to memorize it, though chances are if you do it often enough, you begin to memorize some of the elements of it. And I'm hopeful again that you would have done this in your English 101 class. So in terms of where we are, since we're running a critical paper and we're not using outside resources, the works cited page is less important because you are basically referencing only one source, which is the actual text itself. So in this case, if it turns out that you did not want to submit a works cited page, I'm not going to require you to. Though certainly if you want to practice writing works cited pages, then you want to do it correctly. So you want to make sure that you're following the criteria of the MLA. And again, you can find that on Purdue OWL. You can find that in the GCC library website. You can also ask me as well. And in terms of quotations, they should be exact, word for word, but you do have a little bit of flexibility. If you've ever seen square brackets inside of a quote, not parentheses, square brackets, that's an insertion. That means that was something that was not part of the original quote. It was added in by the writer of the paper, not the writer of the quote. Usually we use that to clarify something in a quote. It's almost like interrupting someone when they're speaking. It's considered rather rude, so you don't want to do it unless you absolutely have to. Certainly you wouldn't do that to comment on the quote. You can do that after the quote. And you don't need to necessarily, in the square brackets, indicate that you're the one that's writing that information, because the assumption is if square brackets occur, you are the author. Usually it's done to clarify things like pronouns. For instance, you might be using a he or a she or a they or an it, and in the context of the quote you've selected, it might be clear what that pronoun is referencing, but it wouldn't necessarily be clear with the quote. So in this instance, he could, let's say, reference either Victor Frankenstein or the creature. So because it's unclear based on the quote you selected, you decide after the word he in square brackets to write Victor. So you're being very clear who the he is referencing. And also you can use an ellipsis, which is fondly known as the three dots or the three periods, inside of a quote. And if you ever see that in a quote, or if you use that in a quote, that means something has been omitted. So this isn't the quote in its entirety, and you've omitted something from that quote just because it's not necessary. You're not omitting to change its meaning. That would be unethical. And you don't need to begin or end a quote with an ellipsis. You can decide where to begin your quote and end your quote at any point. But in between those 2 points, if you leave something out, you would use those 3 periods. And if you've got a very long quote, generally over 4 lines long, not necessarily 4 sentences, but 4 lines, then you would block quote it, which means you indent that quote so that it appears like a smaller block of text within your writing. So it is very easy to skim and see where the quote begins, and more importantly, where it ends. We become conditioned to, when we see quote marks, that we should be expecting the ending quotes fairly soon. But if you've got a long quote, again, over 3 lines or so, then if you block it off, it's very easy to see where it begins and where it ends. And you don't need to use quotation marks in block quotes. That's considered redundant. The quotation mark merely tells the reader where you've begun and ended a quote. By blocking off a quote for a long quote, you wouldn't need to do that. Of course, there has to be one little wrinkle, and the wrinkle is where you put punctuation in block quotes, because what we usually do is when we are quoting and using parenthetical documentation is that immediately after the quote, we put parentheses, and then we either continue on our sentence or put our ending punctuation after the parentheses. It's the opposite with block quotes. Again, keep in mind, we're not using quotation marks. And with a block quote, basically, you put your ending punctuation first, then your parenthetical documentation. So I realized this was quite fast, so I hope this wasn't too fast for you, and I hope it also wasn't too slow for you if it's something that you've heard before. And certainly you can ask me if you've got questions. In fact, today's attendance question is going to be about paper number 2, where I'm going to ask you at this point, do you have an idea about what you will write for, or actually I should have said paper number 1, I'm sorry. Do you have an idea of what you will write for paper number 1? And if so, what is that idea? And you can certainly say, no, I don't know what I'm going to write about, but you should begin thinking about it. And if you've got an idea, certainly try it out. That would be due Saturday the 10th at 9 a.m. So certainly if you needed an extension, you could ask me. And in terms of the discussion forum, as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And that might also give you some ideas of how to pursue a paper if you're not quite sure yet. Again, you can certainly just say no if you don't have an idea yet, but I'm trying to encourage you to think about paper number 1 sooner rather than later. Which gets us to persuasion. So what would be ideal is that you have read persuasion in its entirety by this point, and you're ready to begin our next text. But the reality is oftentimes different than the ideal. So as I indicated, we're going to need next class to talk a little bit about persuasion. We're approximately a class behind. But at the very least, what I wanted to do was to talk about characters in persuasion. As I had indicated, there are many characters who have very similar sorts of names, so it's very easy to get them confused. I recommend keeping a chart, and you can see that in the notes below in the 3rd section, I've listed the characters. I've separated them by gender. There are lots of different ways you can separate these characters. by age, for instance, or perhaps by marital status. And marital status is hugely important in this particular text. But since we are talking about gender, I thought it would be useful to think about these characters in terms of gender. So, the major male characters in the book, the first being Sir Walter Elliot. Sir is a title, and this indicates that he has a certain level of position in society. Keep in mind that we are talking about British society. We don't have these labels in American society. Sir Walter Elliot, he is a widower, and the question is, will he remarry? I believe I had indicated with the Story of an Hour and Mrs. Mallard that there was a higher probability of males remarrying rather than females, especially if the female had a certain level of independence and autonomy. However, Sir Walter Elliot is quite fortunate in that his oldest daughter has sort of taken over the role of the caretaker, so he's not necessarily in a hurry to marry. But there is concern if he will remarry because he has all-female daughters, which means there's no direct heir. So a remarriage could result in a direct male heir. And I think of this book almost like a soap opera. It really is about relationships and the breaking up and the forming of different romantic pairings. Charles Musgrove is married to Sir Walter's youngest daughter, Mary. So now she's a Musgrove. She's not an Elliot. Mary Musgrove. He, Charles Musgrove, had once proposed to Anne Elliot, which happens to be the middle daughter of Sir Walter Elliot's family, and it's through her perspective that the story is told. So you can imagine the tension that the younger sister knows that her husband had once proposed to her older sister, who is the middle sister out of three sisters. There also is a Frederick Wentworth, and the last name is important because he went and he found his worth, which is what we find out happened as we go through the plot of the story. He was a former suitor of Anne's, again, the middle daughter, and this is how the story is told through her perspective. She was persuaded, hence the title, by others not to marry him because he hadn't established himself yet. He really hadn't established himself in terms of his career or in terms of financial security as well as position. Frederick Wentworth is also the brother to a Mrs. Croft. He is single. And this is important because when he comes into town, the major question is, because now he has gone and found his worth, he has financial stability and he also has position that he has achieved through the military. In other words, through hard work and effort, not necessarily through birthright, which is what happens with Sir Walter Elliot. And the aristocracy. And that means that Frederick Wentworth is a very good catch. And the question is, who's going to catch Frederick Wentworth's eye? He had once courted and tried to marry Anne. Of course, she turned him down years ago, so there's tension there. She's never stopped loving him, so she hasn't moved on, basically. And now Anne is much older. She's on the cusp of 30, which would be considered an old maid at that point, and she still hasn't married. And we continually have references in the text to bloom, meaning appearance, that Anne has lost her bloom. She's lost her youthfulness. There also is a William Elliot Esquire being an attorney, so he's established himself well in terms of position, but he doesn't have the birthright of Sir Walter Elliot. But William Elliot is a cousin in the Elliot family, and he's the heir presumptive. That since there are no direct male heirs, the assumption is that he will be the male heir. Notice it wouldn't go to any of the daughters. Eventually, he ends up courting Anne as the story progresses. Mr. Musgrove is Charles Musgrove's father. Notice he doesn't have the title of Sir, he's just a Mr. We have an Admiral Croft. He rents Kellynch Hall, which is the major conflict that begins the story, that Sir Walter Elliot has position, but he no longer has money. And because he's in need of money, he needs to rent out his home. And he needs to do it in such a way so that he doesn't lose face. So he rents his home to someone that he thinks has a certain level of position, but isn't going to overshadow him. And that person happens to be Admiral Croft. Again, he's established himself in the military, he has a title, Admiral. But, of course, he's below Sir Walter Henry. So he rents Kellynch Hall from Sir Walter, and Admiral Croft is married. There is a Captain Harville. This happens to be one of Frederick Wentworth's friends. He's also married and also a captain from the military. So we are introduced to lots of military individuals over the second part of the novel. A Captain Benwick, who is Captain Harville's friend, who was going to marry Captain Harville's sister, Fanny, but she died. So the question is that will he court again, and if so, who will he choose? Again, this is all about finding the proper match. And at that point, relationships were less about a romantic connection and more about social position and financial stability. Affection was determined to occur after, not before marriage. And there also is a Charles Hayter. He's a cousin of the Musgrove family. He's single. He's courting the Henrietta, one of the daughters of the Musgrove family. So we had talked a little bit with Frankenstein. It was not that unusual for blood cousins, actually, to date and even marry in order so that they could maintain the family status. So the female characters in Persuasion, and again, there are lots of different ways you can arrange these characters. You might prefer to do it in terms of relationship, who's single, who's married. There's Elizabeth Elliot. This is Sir Walter's oldest daughter. She's single, but there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of concern for this. Even though she's older than Anne, the assumption is that eventually she'll marry. And while she's not courting anyone now, she's taking care of Sir Walter in the way that his wife used to take care of him. So he's not very anxious about that. There's Anne Elliot, the middle child. Oftentimes it's been said that the middle child is sort of ignored, and that's certainly the sense we get with Anne. She's single, and the question is, who would ever want to court her now that she is approaching, in effect, old age? And then there's Mary Musgrove. This is her younger sister, Anne's younger sister, or Sir Walter's youngest daughter, and she's married. And again, think about the scandal that it's the younger child who's married. And there also is a Lady Russell, lady again, being a position much like Sir, of status. And Lady Russell is a family friend, served as a kind of mother figure to Anne, because Anne is motherless. Again, that theme of motherless children that we're going to see throughout the semester. Lady Russell isn't courting anybody, perhaps not surprising, because she's in a good place financially. So she wouldn't necessarily need marriage. There's a Mrs. Musgrove. This is Charles Musgrove's mother. Again, she doesn't have titles. She's a Mrs. She's married to the Mr. Musgrove. We've got Louisa Musgrove. She's the daughter of the Musgroves, or she's Charles Musgrove's sister. She's single. And of course, the question is, who will she marry? Eventually, she's courted by Frederick Wentworth because he's so attracted to her strong will that she can't be easily persuaded. There's also a Henrietta Musgrove, another daughter of the Musgroves, another sister to Charles Musgrove, who's also single. And she's being courted by her cousin, Charles Hayter. The question is, will they or won't they marry? There's a Mrs. Clay. And again, no title, just a Mrs. She's Elizabeth's friend or daughter. So Elizabeth is just friends with the Mrs., not someone who is part of the landed gentry or the aristocracy or the nobility. And Mrs. Clay is the daughter to a Mr. Shepherd, who happens to be the family attorney. And Mrs. Clay is a widow. And the question is, will she try to find a way to court Sir Walter, because she's spending a lot of time in the Elliot household? And if she did, would that mean that she could produce an heir? So there is that tension of whether or not Mrs. Clay is wanting to improve her status, or does she understand her position? But why would she be spending so much time there with the family if she's not at least somewhat interested in the possibility of marrying or connecting with Sir Walter Elliot? There's a Mrs. Smith. This is a friend of Anne's. Again, that says a lot about Anne's character, that she's willing to spend her time with the missus, not necessarily with someone with status. But Mrs. Smith is a widow and also quite poor and infirm, which is not the case with Mrs. Clay. So there is a difference here between Elizabeth's friend, who's not of status, and Anne's friend, who's not of status. And because Mrs. Smith is so poor and is so in such ill health, she's not courted. And then there's a Mrs. Croft who's married to that Admiral Croft who is renting Kellynch Hall, the Elliot family residence. And this is Frederick Wentworth's sister. So we can see how all of these characters connect to one another. And this would not have been that unusual either. Think about the fact that they didn't have the modes of transportation that we have today. So usually family members lived very close to one another, and one social circle was quite small. Yet another reason why there were oftentimes marriages within families. In terms of minor characters, there's a Viscountess Dalrymple that we're introduced to later on in the novel. She's Sir Walter's relative, and as a Viscountess, she is higher up in status than Sir Walter is. So we get to see not only how Sir Walter treats those below him in status, but when she's introduced later in the novel, we get to see how he treats those who are higher than him in status. And the family attorney that I had referenced earlier, the Mr. Shepherd, who is the father to the Mrs. Clay. Again, quite a few characters here, but I hope that helped to clarify things. Persuasion is divided up into 2 volumes, which I'll be talking about next class. And again, as I had indicated, I'm giving an extension on the journal Persuasion until next week because we are a little bit behind. And our attendance question again, which would be due on our class discussion forum by Saturday, which would be the 10th at 9 a.m. Do you have an idea of what you would write about for paper number 1? And if so, what is that idea? And again, you're perfectly free to say that no, you don't have an idea, but I'm hoping that I can begin to push you to begin to contemplate possibilities. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will talk about Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.